Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we digging into today?
Well, it seems like everywhere you turn these days, someone's talking about Russia, Putin, and you guessed it, communism.
Yeah, that whole is Russia still communist debate seems to be everywhere.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. Is this label accurate, or does it miss the mark?
It's a question worth exploring.
Definitely. Now, the source material we're looking at today makes a really interesting point right off the bat.
Oh,
The author argues that this communist Russia label is often used more as a conversation stopper than a starting point for real discussion.
I see. Like using a label to shut down analysis rather than encourage it.
Exactly. It's like people hear Russia and communism and immediately think, well, that explains it. Case closed.
When in reality, it's far more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. And to further complicate things, the source points out that Russia itself isn't exactly going around waving the communist flag, are they?
Right. It's not like they're actively promoting communist ideology on the world stage.
Precisely. In fact, when it comes to how Russians view their own history, it's complex. The source talks about how, yeah, there might be some nostalgia for certain aspects of the Soviet era.
But the social safety net or the space race.
Exactly. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a desire to, like, turn back the clock and return to a full-blown communist system.
It's kind of like how some people look back on their teenage years. Sure, there are some fond memories, but it doesn't mean we'd ever want to go back to being teenagers again.
Exactly. We recognize that things change, people evolve, and countries do too.
So, if we're not viewing Russia through a purely ideological lens, what should we be focusing on?
Well, the source argues that we need to understand this concept of realpolitik.
Realpolitik. Sounds intense.
It kind of is.
Hmm.
Essentially, it boils down to understanding a country's actions based on its practical concerns and national self-interest, often taking precedence over ideology.
So it's less about what a country says it believes and more about what its actions reveal about its true priorities.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Actions often speak louder than words, especially in international relations.
Right. And the source goes on to suggest that even when the Soviets were framing their actions in terms of communist ideals, those actions can often be traced back to much more practical concerns.
Like what?
Things like securing their borders, projecting power, maintaining influence in key regions. Basically, classic national interest stuff.
Okay, so some things never really change.
Exactly. It's those core, enduring interests, the kind that transcend ideology and political systems.
Makes you wonder what those core interests look like for Russia today.
We'll definitely get into that, but first, okay, so we're moving away from communist Russia as our primary lens, but that leaves a pretty big question. What does explain Russia's actions on the world stage?
Right, what other theories are out there?
Well, the source dives into something called Cheikhism, and let me tell you, it's a bit of a doozy.
Cheekism. Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Break it down for me.
So imagine this, a clandestine group, maybe with roots in the KGB, operating behind the scenes, pulling the strings of Russian politics.
Hold on, are we talking like a deep state situation?
In a way, yeah. And this is where those Siloviki we've talked about before come into play.
Right, the Siloviki. Remind us again who they are.
Basically, they're those powerful figures in Russian politics, often with backgrounds in intelligence agencies like the KGB.
Okay, so these Siloviki, with their KGB connections, are supposedly part of this shadowy Cheekist network.
That's the gist of it, and according to the source, the Siloviki's prominence in Putin's government is seen as potential evidence for this theory.
I can see how that would raise some eyebrows.
For sure. But here's where things get even wilder. The author points out that this Cheekist theory can get pretty out there, with some versions even drawing comparisons to, get this, occult groups controlling world events.
Whoa. Okay, we went from 0 to 60 there. Secret societies and shadowy intelligence figures. It's giving Dan Brown novel.
I know, right? So with such a wide range of interpretations, where does the author ultimately land on this whole Checkism idea?
Well, they actually present a pretty balanced perspective. They lay out two contrasting narratives about Czechism, both revolving around the fall of the Soviet Union.
Oh, this should be good. Lay it on me.
So, narrative number one. The KGB was significantly weakened by the Soviet collapse.
Really? You'd think a chaotic transition would play right into their hands.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But think about it. The Soviet Union was their patron, their reason for being. Losing that led to internal power struggles within the KGB, loss of funding, a real identity crisis.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't considered it that way. It wasn't just a seamless transfer of power.
Exactly. Now, narrative number two is basically the opposite. The KGB orchestrated the collapse all along.
Intriguing. Why would they do that? Wouldn't they want to hold on to power?
Well, the theory goes that they saw the writing on the wall, that the Soviet system was crumbling, and they were worried about losing their grip on power. So they allowed the Soviet Union to fall apart so they could swoop in as the saviors, the ones who bring order to the chaos.
A calculated gamble to maintain control. Bold move.
Right, but the author points out some pretty big holes in this theory.
Like what?
Well, for starters, if the KGB were really calling the shots, why would they orchestrate a collapse that ultimately weakened Russia on the world stage? Wouldn't it make more sense to try to maintain the Soviet Union's status as a superpower, even a declining one?
That's a really good point. It does seem to contradict their presumed goal of global dominance.
Exactly. And wouldn't they be more likely to try to infiltrate and co-opt Western institutions if they wanted to reshape the world order? The author argues that the KGB orchestrating the Soviet collapse just doesn't quite add up.
It's a complicated puzzle, for sure. But I appreciate that the source doesn't offer any easy answers.
Me too. It's a good reminder to be wary of those grand narratives about shadowy groups pulling strings from the shadows. Real life is rarely that neat and tidy.
Absolutely. So if we're setting aside the Chekist theory, at least for now, what other factors might be shaping Putin and Russia's actions today?
Well, the source points to another element that's often overlooked in analyses of Putin's Russia: religion.
Okay, now that's interesting. We've talked ideology, we've talked geopolitics, but religion as a whole new dimension. Religion, huh? You don't hear that angle every day. What's the source's take on the whole Putin-religion connection?
Well, they make a pretty compelling case for Putin having genuine religious convictions, and it's not just speculation either. They point to some concrete actions. For example, Putin has consistently put government money into restoring churches all across Russia.
Interesting. But wouldn't that be expected? I mean, a leader supporting traditional institutions, it seems like a safe political move.
You'd think so, right? But the source points out that there isn't really any political pressure on Putin to do this. It's not like he's pandering to a huge voting bloc or anything.
That's a good point. If anything, you could argue that aligning himself too closely with the church might even rub some people the wrong way.
Exactly, but he's been remarkably consistent in his support. So the author suggests that maybe, just maybe, Putin sees himself as more than just a politician.
Like a spiritual leader as well.
In a way, yeah. Someone who sees himself as responsible for guiding Russia towards a new moral foundation after the whole ideological upheaval of the Soviet collapse.
So if Russia's trying to move beyond its communist past, is the source saying that religion, specifically Russian Orthodoxy, is being positioned as the new cornerstone of Russian identity?
It's not quite that simple. The author emphasizes that Russia is still very much a work in progress. They compare it to other periods in Russian history where leaders tried to redefine what it means to be Russian, blending tradition and, modern ideas. It's too early to tell what this new identity will ultimately look like.
Makes sense. It's a complex dance between their history and where they're headed in the future. But it makes me wonder, how does this all play out on the world stage? If Russia is trying to forge this new identity, what does it mean for everyone else?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The author stresses that understanding Putin's vision for Russia, whatever it may be, is absolutely crucial for navigating the complexities of global politics today.
It's like we need a whole new playbook,
Yeah.
right? One that goes beyond those old Cold War labels and digs into the nuances of what motivates Russia today.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? It forces us to challenge our assumptions, dig a little deeper, embrace the complexity.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for our listeners who are just joining us on this deep dive into Russia, what would you say is the most important thing to remember?
Don't underestimate Russia. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you've got them all figured out based on outdated labels and Cold War baggage. Russia is a nation in transition, searching for its place in a rapidly changing world. Understanding what makes them tick is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of what's happening on the global stage today.
So well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If Putin's vision for Russia isn't driven by those old communist ideals, what is it rooted in? What values and ideas are shaping their path? And what role will they play in shaping our collective future? These are the questions worth pondering. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and dive deep.